Well, good day, everybody. Welcome to another lunch break with the leaders. This is the third one in our series. I hope you guys are digging the background here. So I said, you know what? I'm going to have some lunch brunch set up for this afternoon. So last week I was cooking, as you guys saw in my kitchen. Today I have you guys can put in the chat what you have for lunch. So I have a typical DC lunch. I didn't have time to cook. So I got some fried chicken wings with mumbo sauce. Mumbo sauce is something that the DC people came up with, and you can put mumbo sauce in your fried chicken, your ribs. You can put it on your pork chops, your steak. Mumbo sauce is literally good on anything, omelets, vegetables, you name it. So that's a DC staple that we have here. So let us know where you guys are from. What commands are you calling from? How did you hear about Lunch Break with the Leaders? We're excited to have you guys here today. We are streaming live on YouTube and on Zoom. So yes, drop this in the chat. So we're actually going to we have an amazing discussion today from Dr. Brad Johnson and Dr. David Smith. We're going to be speaking to you guys for Women's Observance Month. And so we're going to be taking questions and answers. So they're going to have a great presentation. Secretary Kessmeyer is going to introduce them. And so, I'm going to be in the chat. I'm going to go off screen, going to be in the chat. So, welcome. And Secretary Kessmeyer, take it away.
Thanks, Ashley. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning or good evening to those that are abroad. Welcome to our third session of Lunch Break with Leaders, as Ashley said. For those of you that haven't met me before, I am Kathy Kessmeyer. I'm the Assistant Secretary for Manpower and Reserve Affairs here in the Department of the Navy. This month, all of you know that we're hosting these virtual lunch breaks where we can have, some candid conversations, frank discussions with Secretariat, Navy, and Marine Corps leaders. All of them have achieved some level of success in their careers. They've brought for us a lot of unique perspectives on how they've navigated their journey. It's been pretty enlightening for me. I hope it's been enlightening for all of you. I really, truly appreciate everyone's participation. So thank you for joining us today. As Ashley mentioned, today's session is going to feature two professors, Dr. Brad Johnson and Dr. David Smith. Both of them are professors at the Naval Academy. Dr. Smith is also a professor at the Naval War College and a former Navy captain. They've conducted research and they're experts in mentoring relationships, gender workplace issues, and specifically men as allies and men as mentors. They've published hundreds of professional articles. They've captured their research into two fascinating books. The first one I'm gonna do a little showcase here: Athena Rising: How and Why Men Should Mentor Women, and then Good Guys: How Men Can Be Better Allies for Women in the Workplace. This book will become available in October. Actually, I think it is available, right? It became available in October of this year. We've hosted these sessions every Wednesday during the month of March. We've had such a good response, and I want to thank all of you for participating. Our sessions are going to be posted and continue to be posted on the MNRA portal. Please feel free, as Ashley mentioned, to use the question and answer feature that's on Zoom to go ahead and submit the questions you have for today's guests. Because of your participation and the demand for this series, it's our hope that we're going to be able to continue this into next month with some different themes. So let me, without further ado, go ahead and welcome Dr. Johnson and Smith. Thank you both for joining us. I understand that you're going to give us a few snippets of your research, and then we're going to go ahead and open it up to questions and answers. So again, I encourage everybody to go ahead and use that link to submit questions. So gentlemen, as you join us, could you talk to us a little bit about what motivated you to to think about and research how men can be more inclusive leaders and better mentors and allies for women? And talk to us a little bit about what made you write these books and what your research is telling you.
Yeah, thank you, Secretary Kessmeyer. It's great to be here with the whole Navy Marine Corps family today, and with our tribe, as we like to think about it. And we'll go through some of that in our slides here, but let me give you a little bit of that background to how we got to start doing this work. And as you heard, I'm a retired Navy captain. I spent 30 years in the Navy, and 20 of those years doing pilot stuff, and then the last 10 years as an academic, after I got my PhD in sociology and teaching at the Naval Academy with my good friend, colleague, and co-conspirator here, Dr. Brad Johnson. And it was clear that, in our time teaching together, as we began to think about the research that we were doing, in particular, Brad as a clinical psychologist and doing his research in the area of what makes for great mentoring and sponsoring around the advocacy component of that relationships, and my own research that focuses on the intersection of gender, work, and family. And it was clear to us that one of the challenges with solving a lot of the inequities we find in the workplace is that often, especially around gender, that these are labeled as women's initiatives, women's leadership programs, and that guys, we would often not engage in those. They would see it as, hey, it's not my role, not my responsibility, not my place. And so getting men engaged in doing this work was a challenge. And so reframing these not as women's or gender issues, but more as leadership issues, that we as men and women have to come as leaders to the table to solve these for our workplaces. And so that led to our first book, Athena Rising, which is all about great mentoring relationships and how we can engage men in being better mentors and more inclusive mentors, which came out in 2016. Of course, about a year later, Me Too went widespread around the world, and Brad and I found ourselves being pulled more into these broader conversations about what does it look like to show up as an ally in the workplace. So no matter what level of leadership you're in, and not just in the specific area of mentoring and sponsoring, but just how do I show up in the relationships I have, and making sure that it's an equitable and fair workplace. And so we set out to do the research for that, which led to our new book that was just released in October of 2020. Through Harvard Business Review Press, and that's Good Guys: How Men Can Be Better Allies for Women in the Workplace. And let me let Brad tell you a little bit about how we went about doing this research, and then we'll press on and give you a little bit of the best of.
Yeah, and again, thanks to Secretary Kessmeyer for including us. I'm delighted to be here, just as David is. And my start in the Navy began as a medical service corps officer, psychologist, and now have been at the Naval Academy for years teaching. All of my research has been in mentoring and sponsoring, and really looking at what that looks like when it's done well from the perspective of mentees. But I've always been bothered a bit by the data showing that women don't get the same kind of mentorship, and they say certainly don't get sponsored in the same way that men do. Certainly, men are reluctant for different reasons to lean into mentoring and sponsoring with women, and that has intrigued me and bothered me. And then my colleague Dave came along, and all his work was in the area of gender. And we started having these great conversations about how we could get men to be more thoughtful and active and deliberate about engaging for equity in the workplace. I also note, just as we kick off in response to the Secretary's question, that I think for both David and I, there's a real personal motivation here. Dave didn't mention that his wife is also a naval officer, retired now, and he got to watch her headwinds in the Navy and experiencing things, of course, that he never did. For me, my personal connection is my sister, Shannon Johnson, who's a captain in the Medical Service Corps, an amazing officer who is currently the commanding officer of Naval Hospital Bremerton. And that was really kind of my touchstone personally, to recognizing how different women experience the workplace. My sister, has 3 combat deployments, aircraft carrier tour. She has done it all in the Navy with great grace and aplomb. And yet men still come up to her almost every week and tell her she should smile more. When she gives men difficult feedback, she's been told she's emasculating. I have to say, I have never been given that kind of feedback, even though my sister and I have a very similar interpersonal style. So I think it's my relationship with my sister that has kind of piqued my personal interest in this. And to the point of the research, David and I went out and interviewed lots and lots of women. We asked women, what does it look like for you when a guy really shows up as a mentor, a sponsor, a colleague, an ally at work? Tell us about the behaviors. And really what we've done is put those into these 2 books, and really want to kind of give them away to men so that men can have a better understanding of what women wish they knew about being a better mentor and a better colleague at work. So we're going to give you some best of today.
Yeah, so it's clear.
Great. I'm looking forward to it. I'm certain that everyone is. Thank you.
Yeah. And I'll just present a little bit of the research here, and it's popping up pretty fast for you, but it's clear across industries and profession, including our own, that the more equity, gender equity in particular, diversity you have across every level of leadership, all the way to the most senior parts of your organization, the better performance you have in your organization. They're just better places to work. You make better decisions. You're more innovative, more creative. The corporate world looks at this and goes, wow, we make more money. We're more profitable. In our world around national security and defense, we're more effective in accomplishing the mission out there. And certainly the larger outcomes in national security are pretty clear when you see this research. But yet we still find that women are excluded in a variety of different ways. And that's everything from hiring and recruiting to retention to advancement and promotion. And it's interesting that today is equal pay day, if you didn't realize that. And so certainly the pay equity gap is alive and well in this country, and probably even worse today because of the pandemic situation that we're in. Yet it's interesting in the research that we did is you talk to men, most men do believe in gender equity. They do believe in gender equality, yet we still find these differences going on in our organizations. And interestingly, Harvard Business did a study just a few years ago, and they asked this basic question to executives across organizations. They said, do you include women in all the important decisions that you make in your company? And of course, 92% of the men said, yeah, absolutely. It's critical to our company to do that. And they asked the women, unfortunately, 82% of the women said, no, I still feel like I'm being excluded in one way or another. So we have a bit of a gap, and exploring that gap is really important. One thing is clear, that when men are engaged in doing this work, it makes a difference.
So this is one illustration of Dave's point. This is from Boston Consulting Group just a year or two ago, going out across numerous companies and asking women in particular, is your company or your organization making real progress on gender diversity and inclusion? And the number one predictor of whether women said yes or no was whether or not they saw men engaged in championing gender diversity and inclusion. And when that was true, 96% of women said, yep, my organization's getting it, versus only 30% when men were not engaged. So there are different reasons that men are reluctant, we find. And, there are different reasons. When Dave and I were doing Athena Rising, we found so many of them. We gave this a term, reluctant male syndrome. Men can be anxious, right? Don't know what to do. Don't want to step in it. Don't want to make a mistake. I have biases about women. Maybe I don't see them as future leaders. I'm concerned about gossip or rumors. And then along comes Me Too. And now up to 60% of men in the corporate world are saying, yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just not comfortable having a mentoring meeting or a coffee conversation with a woman at work. I'm afraid of the optics. So can we all just take a pause on Me Too, and especially men, I think, and remember what this is about. This is about women asking to come to work and not be assaulted or harassed. Super low bar for men to get over. And yet you're hearing all the false narratives that women are dangerous, right? Or I can't talk to them at work. Simply not true. And as a clinical psychologist, I'll just share that if you have anxiety about talking to women or mentoring women, there's only one treatment for that. It's called exposure therapy, and it involves more conversations, more lunches, more interaction with women. And, if you're still unsure, one of the things that Dave and I hear frequently from men is, gosh, the attraction thing might get in my way. What if I find her attractive? I'm not sure I could possibly mentor her. So we have a big medical breakthrough, and I know some of you on the call today are medical. It turns out men have a frontal lobe. And the beauty of this is, I can be aware that someone I work with is attractive and also have impulse control and judgment, good decision making. So if we're men, let's not put this on women. If we get hung up and have anxiety, let's cure that ourselves by more interaction, more engagement.
So what do we mean by allyship? Really, there's lots of definitions out there, but when we talk about it, we're going to talk about it in kind of two broad categories. The first is what we call interpersonal allyship. And this is just how individually we show up in the workplace, holding ourselves accountable for the kinds of relationships that we have, being collaborative, being supportive in our relationships, working towards gender equity, towards fairness and justice. And a lot of the guys that we talked to for the interviews, they told us this is really the easy part when we talk about allyship, because I only have to worry about myself and holding myself accountable for doing the work. The harder part was the second part, and that's public allyship, which also has a systemic aspect to it. And this is really not just holding myself accountable, but wow, now I have to hold others accountable. And now I really feel like I'm putting some skin in the game. Some guys talked about how it made them really uncomfortable because they felt like they were accepting a certain amount of personal or professional risk in holding others accountable, and understanding as I see bias in a particular practice in my organization, now I have to disrupt that, right? That's part of disrupting the systemic aspects of allyship. So really interesting. And we're going to give you a little bit of the best of each of these categories today, but let us talk to you a little bit about where you need to start.
So this often surprises men in particular, and we're going to get into the real elements of active allyship here in just a moment. But before you even get there, let me just take a step back and tell you that if you're a man and you happen to be partnered with a woman, one of the first things that you've got to do is start sharing equally at home. The data is really clear. Even before the pandemic, when women were partnered with a male and both were working full time, she was still doing 2 times the amount of domestic work, the amount of childcare. And now with the pandemic, women are doing 2 to 3 times the amount. Now we're adding homeschooling on. And I think it's really clear, and it should be obvious, women are never going to get to share equally in the workplace, share equally in opportunities at work if their partners are not leaning in as full-on allies at home. So if you happen to be a male on this call, you need to go home today and ask your partner, especially if you're partnered with a woman, am I doing my full share? And if you're not, we call this a domestic audit. If you're not, ask, what can I do? Don't get defensive. Just say, what can I do to start really stepping up today?
So let's get into it. So part one is really, again, back to the interpersonal allyship and how do we think about our relationships and how do we show up and do this and where do we begin? And well, you really need to begin with self-education. And this really gets to the idea that we've got to begin to develop our GQ, our gender intelligence in this case. And that does require a certain amount of starting with yourself and putting it on yourself and attending sessions like today to learn more about this, reading great books and articles. There's all sorts of information out there in the world. And reading that with a sense of, hey, let me put that into the context of what's going on in the workplace and where do I see how others experience the workplace very differently than I do. And as you begin to make those connections between what you're reading about or hearing about and seeing actually in the workplace, then you can begin to have those conversations with your female colleagues about this. And, we can approach this with a certain amount of humility that I don't necessarily have all the answers here. And I'm really going to approach this with some curiosity and a learning orientation that I don't really understand what it means necessarily, maybe to understand how you experience the workplace and be very, again, approaching our female colleagues in a very trusting way, open up that conversation about, can I ask you about your experiences here? And if there was one thing I could do maybe more or less of to be a better ally in the workplace, what would that look like? And some guys even told us that was even uncomfortable to ask it that way. And sometimes it just felt like I had to ask whether it was okay if I could ask about your experiences here. And so that's another good way to think about how we can do this. The last part of this is really remembering that we need to have some cultural humility and awareness as well, that like men, women are not a monolith, right? They don't all have the same experiences. And that in particular, we know that women of color have very different experiences in the workplace. And we certainly see that today with the pandemic too. That, again, not approaching and making assumptions that just because one woman has experiences that they all have it that way. As we were talking to women, they said that the number one skill that they most appreciated in their allies and in their mentors, and the one that they wish in some cases men were better at, was their listening skills. And they talked about this with listening with an intent to understand, right? Not to fix me, not to fix a problem, but to really understand what's going on here. And then as I develop this empathy and this understanding, then I can think about, all right, where are my opportunities now based on my role and position that I can make a difference? I can make a change in the workplace so that it's better for her.
Got to watch the assumptions. And, this is in our research for Athena Rising, we got to interview the woman that you see here. This is Janet Petro. She's deputy director of the Kennedy Space Center. And she raved about this gentleman as her mentor. This is Robert Lightfoot. We got to interview him as well. He was a director of NASA at the time. And he said, guys, let me just tell you where I really got it wrong mentoring women early on. And I would make assumptions. They were well intended, but they were assumptions. So I was on a search committee, as an example. Our top candidate for this executive position at NASA was a woman. And in the final meeting, as we were going around, I wanted to show how gender savvy I was before we offered the job. So I said, this job involves a lot of travel. And she did just have a baby. I don't know. And he said, luckily, a woman was sitting across the table from me with flames coming from her eyes. And she said, Robert, I'm certain that she knows this job involves travel. And I'm also certain she knows she had a baby. So how about if she's our candidate, you don't decide for her? And he said it was such a light bulb moment. I was missing it. I was making assumptions about her, and I wasn't checking with her directly. So guys, let's check our assumptions.
One of the critical pieces to closing the allyship gap that I referred to at the beginning is really getting feedback, because often as men, as allies, we think, again, because we believe in gender equity, we're doing everything out there, the work to create it. And often we're falling short, or we're missing the mark in terms of, just like we heard about Robert Lightfoot. So one of the great things, and we can really, I think, learn a lot from, is when we get feedback from our female colleagues on how well we're doing, and they can help to hold us accountable for doing the work and doing it in a way where it really makes a difference. But we have to be ready to respond to it in a way that shows that we care and we value it. And we provide a few options here to think about. Hey, these are ways that show that I really care and I see it as a gift, and not responding in a defensive or threatened way.
We have to watch the gaslighting. Too many women report that when they share something that's happened to them in the workplace, maybe it was some sort of harassment, maybe it was just some egregious sexism or a really biased comment that got made in a meeting. Too often the first response they hear is what really amounts to gaslighting, right? It undermines her perception, her experience of reality. It makes her wonder if she's exaggerating. And too often these responses come from men. And so if I want to be a better ally, I need to start with something else, not a gaslighting response. How about, I believe you, and could you tell me more about this? And then how could I collaborate with you to make sure this doesn't continue?
As we develop an awareness, then we have to start looking around in our workplace and seeing, how do we look in various situations to see how this plays out? And we can begin to do this by asking several different kinds of questions. And this could be just, who's in the room, who was included, who was invited, who got excluded, who didn't get a seat at the table, who did get a seat at the table, who's got the microphone, who's getting plenty of airtime, who's getting interrupted more than everybody else. And then who's having their ideas heard and valued, and who's having their ideas heard and then stolen. Over and over again, we heard these stories from women when we interviewed, and very senior women, about how often they would have an idea, they put it out there in front of the team, and then everybody be like, oh, okay, whatever. And then 3 guys later, the same idea is now repackaged as his own, and now it's the greatest idea I've ever heard. And, it just kind of, I know Brad and I at the time, we were listening to this in these interviews, it kind of shocked us because we had never experienced that. And again, if you don't have an awareness of a problem, it's really hard to fix it. Now that I am aware of it, I can say, oh, well, wait a minute, Brad, how is that any different than what Kathy just said? Right? I can disrupt it in the moment, and I can begin to create a change there. But we have to begin to use that awareness in the situation.
Women told us very clearly in the interviews that they do value mentoring from men. I mean, especially in the military when it's mostly men in senior leadership. And we know that sponsoring is incredibly powerful, often as part of mentorship. Often these are really useful relationships for women. But they said, I'm not looking for this dude. This is the guru mentor model. Maybe you've seen him. He's the kind of guy who wants to just dispense his wisdom and have you listen. He's not interested in your perspective. He doesn't expect to learn anything from you. And he always seems to know everything. He never says the words, I don't know. And we find that women said, I find that really aversive. I'm looking for something quite different.
And that different is really a mutual or reciprocal relationship. If we can look at it, and whether it's a mentoring relationship or even as peers, as colleagues, we can listen and learn, right? And we can share information that I always have something I can learn from the other person that there's learning that goes both directions, and people attain a lot more benefits out of those kinds of relationships if we approach them that way. And certainly we found this in our own research that men who were mentoring women and men who were in allyships with women in particular, they talked about how we found more increased access to information in parts of the organization that they wouldn't have otherwise had. They have more diverse networks, both internal to their own organization and external. And I think the really great part of this was these enhanced or increased interpersonal skills. And this was really around empathy, emotional intelligence, and communication skills. And gosh, it just makes us better leaders overall. And we would like more of that in our organizations. And the wonderful part of that is that at the end of the day, that, you know, you don't have to check that at the door. You get to take that home with you, and that makes you a better partner and a better parent. So we're going to press on into the last part here, last few minutes, and give you a little bit of the best of around what does public allyship look like, and what is, you know, why is this really hard and challenging out there? Because really we're going to have to start doing some disruption of the status quo and really thinking about how do we confront people in the system to make change.
So, you know, starting out, Dave and I have referred to these as watchdog skills, and this really comes from all the research around bystander effect. And what we know from that research is that, you know, and we've all been there, by the way, you're sitting in that meeting, maybe some guy says something really sexist, really demeaning related to women, maybe even tells a harassing joke. We're all uncomfortable. We look out of the corner of our eyes, but we find that if 2 or 3 seconds go by, no one's going to disrupt it. We've sort of lost the opportunity. So this bystander paralysis sets in. So message to all of us, but especially men who are usually in the majority in these meetings, I got to be willing to call this out, right? And if I don't know what to say exactly, although I feel very uncomfortable what was just said, how about just saying, ouch? We love the ouch technique. You know, it buys me a couple more seconds while everyone in the room looks at me. And now I can explain, hey, this did not land okay with me, and here's why. We don't talk that way here. It's not who we are. I don't like the way you just demean my female colleagues. I got to own it, got to use I statements. I cannot say, hey, Dave, dude, you can't talk like that when women are in the room. That suggests that that's fine when women are not present, but it's not fine. And then how about confronting other men? This is really tough for some gentlemen. You know, I don't want to lose my man card, don't want to suffer the wimp penalty. So I may just ignore the comments that are clearly diminishing the work culture and the environment. So how do I do this? We have a hashtag, #BroKnow, that we often, you know, sort of recommend that we can use. And I can go to a guy after a meeting, if it's not such an egregious thing that he said, and have the #BroKnow conversation. Hey, you can't say that. When you said that today in the meeting, everyone cringed. Let me tell you why. You need to get better. Sometimes something is so inappropriate that I'm going to call it out right there in the meeting. I'm going to do the #BroKnow right there. It's got to be stopped. It's got to be recognized as inappropriate, and I need to call it out. Also need to provide transparency. And, you know, in the military, this may not feel like as big a deal. In corporate America, it certainly is. But there's still a lot of secret intel that gets passed among men, right? Who's making how much money? What job benefits have people worked out or arranged? Who's in line for the next promotion? Or how are people being ranked, right? If women are not cut into this intel, we are not going to get to gender equity, especially around things like pay and promotion. So if I'm a guy and I want to be a better ally, I need to be transparent with my female colleagues about things like pay and opportunities and upcoming advancements. And I don't know how this would fly in the Navy. I love, Dave and I actually both love this technique from JP Morgan. And I wonder if this is a pledge that in your military command, you know, you could recommend some of the gentlemen take. JP Morgan, a number of years ago, recognized they were bringing in all kinds of talented women. They were not retaining them. And so they started asking senior men to take this pledge, 36 minutes a week. Would you spend 30 minutes mentoring a junior woman? Take her to coffee, have a conversation about her career and next steps. Spend 5 minutes giving a female colleague a shout out for a win or an achievement, and spend 1 minute telling other people, maybe higher in the chain of command, what she has achieved, kind of doing that loud sponsoring. Easy lift, 36 minutes a week, and JP Morgan started to see more women promoted and retained and pushed up into senior leadership. And around the sponsor sponsorship piece. I think the favorite story Dave and I had around the sponsorship message came from our interviews for Athena Rising. We got to interview Sheryl Sandberg here, and she said, if I could tell men one thing, it's do the sponsorship. If you actually care about equity, you've got to sponsor women the same way that you sponsor men. So litmus test for men. Are you talking about her when she's not even in the room? Are you her raving fan? Too often, I think men can feel uncomfortable about that. Gosh, if I'm her raving fan, people might get the wrong idea, or maybe I'll start a rumor. Well, we need to get over that. And if you're uncomfortable with this, you should be sponsoring multiple women, right? Multiple women and men. And then it's just part of your brand, right? There's no rumor here. There's no story. We just know you as somebody who raves about the work of terrific women, even when they're not in the room.
You can also do this on a daily basis, and this could be just as simple as advocating for someone where, in particular, women, we find that their expertise is often devalued or dismissed or overlooked. And if we can kind of acknowledge and see our own privilege and how our power and social capital can be used for good here, I know that in a lot of times in meetings, the attention might come naturally to me as one of the more senior men in the room, and whether I'm the expert or not on the topic. And I can just very quickly say, hey, I'd love to share my thoughts with you on that here, but Maya is the expert. I'd love to hear what she has to say. And there I've quickly handed her the mic, done a lateral toss. But, men told us that as they acknowledged and they understood how this attention came to them, they could decenter that attention. They could shift the focus of attention to someone else. And very quickly, that's again, sharing your own social capital and your power, which is another form of advocacy that we can use. The last few parts here, I want to talk about leadership for just a minute. And one of the things I get to do as a researcher, looking at leadership styles and how it influences people, is we certainly know that there are some very stereotypical differences around as we perceive each other and how we see each other as leaders. And that women, if they lead in a very stereotypically masculine way, the more agentic, more dominant, more directive way, authoritative, they get labeled your favorite B word. Bossy, not the other one. And of course, we know if they lead in a more stereotypically feminine way, so more participative, more collaborative, democratic, then they're not seen as strong leader material out there. So they get caught in this double bind, this damned if they do and damned if they don't. And certainly as men, we have a lot more flexibility when it comes to our leadership style. The question is, what does it matter? So what? And the answer to that is yes, it matters in several different ways. Let me just show you a couple examples. And one is in our performance reviews. So these were taken out of military ones by just as an example here in a study that we did. And we find the subjective language we use to describe people as leaders and the proscriptive language, the negative language we use to describe, is very different for men and women. And that can have a valuing difference in terms of how we see somebody as being promotable or not, in terms of advancing into the senior levels of our organization. Certainly, if you think about the number one positive attribute for women, compassionate, very positive, and the number one for analytical is for men. I'd like to be seen as both, but the question is, does it turn into a value difference? And the answer is, there's new research out that shows that it does. It does connect into benefits, promotion opportunities, advancements, a whole slew of things that it can help to explain why we don't see more women moving up through the ranks. So what can we do about this? How can we be more inclusive as leaders? And certainly as senior leaders, there's a couple particular traits and techniques we can use. And one is around clarity, and this idea that as senior leaders, we need to be very clear about why things like diversity, equity, and inclusion are important to us. What's your personal narrative? Can you talk about it? Can you be comfortable talking about it? Can you share a story with somebody that shows that it connects with you personally? And then can you turn and connect that back to your business, to your organization? Why is this important to our mission, to what we do? And that's where it really begins to make a difference in an organization, when leaders can communicate strategically in this way. The second part is transparency, being very transparent about when we have programs and initiatives that are around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and advancing different groups, that that, why do we have these programs? What are we doing? How are we doing them? And then how are we progressing at doing them? Being very transparent in that, because that helps to build trust in our organization. Very critical for us in the military. And the last part is accountability. How do we begin to hold leaders accountable for doing this work? And this can happen in a slew of different ways. Performance reviews obviously would be one way we can begin to mainstream this and hold leaders accountable, but we can also hold them accountable for how they implement and create policy, right? Do we create policies that are not only good for me, but they're good for other people out there as well? And thinking about, what does that look like? All right, I think we're going to stop there. Sharing you just a little bit of the kind of the best of both books, and turn it back over for some more questions and answers and more conversation. And I'll stop the share.
Great. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. I think a lot of us learned from both of you today. I know I personally took away some really good points that you've shared with us. One of the questions that we have that came in, I think, is very timely. So right now, many of us are working in this remote environment. In fact, that's what we're doing today, right? We're having a virtual meeting. So in that kind of remote workforce, remote environment, how do you recommend that men serve as allies or mentors to women in this kind of interesting time that we're living in, and something that probably will be with us post-pandemic?
Yeah, what a great question to lead off with. And I can jump in, and Dave, I know you'll have thoughts about this, but I think that there's a real risk right now. We're seeing millions of women stepping away, being forced away from the job market right now during the pandemic. And I don't know exactly what our military numbers are like right now, but certainly in the rest of the world, we're losing female talent. And I think there's a real risk that women are left out of meetings. Women are not getting FaceTime. Women may feel ignored. They may feel like they're not getting the intel about upcoming opportunities or promotions. So, certainly if I'm a guy who's already committed to mentoring a woman, and now we're in this remote workplace, I have an obligation, in my view, to go ahead and make sure that I continue. I need to continue to reach out to her. I can do that remotely. I can check in with email and say, I was just thinking about you and noticing that we haven't had a lot of conversation lately. I hope you're doing okay. I can kind of do that check-in. That's an easy lift. We talked about that 36-minute pledge a week. Well, that should continue even when we're in the remote environment. And then how about the sponsorship stuff? That doesn't have to stop. Yes, we're in remote meetings, but boy, I can continue to introduce you to folks. I can continue to network you. I can make sure that you get invited to a Zoom meeting because something important is being discussed and I'd like you to be involved in it. And maybe I'd even like you to run the meeting and be the subject matter expert. As a mentor and a sponsor, I need to make sure that you're not losing FaceTime, that you're not slipping off anyone's grid, and that's not difficult any more than it is in the in-person world. But Dave, anything else you'd recommend there?
No, I thought that was a great list of them there.
Great. Well, I'm going to go to some of the Q&As that are coming in, so bear with me. I'm probably going to sound like I'm reading them. But one of the questions we have is that a common issue that many women are facing in the workplace is, when they're passionate about their work, they're viewed sometimes as being emotional, right? So what advice would you give those on the call today to kind of overcome that perception that behavior is something that we need to change, that being emotional, when it's really, for us, something that's more directed at the passion for our work?
Yeah, it's a great question. One that, came up in our research for both books, actually. And because it's really interesting, because in some ways, handling and dealing and thinking about emotions and emotional responses when we have interactions can motivate particular kinds of behavior that are not always helpful, and certainly can hold us back and make us more reluctant in terms of engaging in different ways. And so one of the things from an allyship perspective, if we think about this and understand that, hey, if a woman begins to get labeled emotional when she's talking about something in that way, is to reframe that, right? And reframe emotional into being passionate about something. And certainly we see that with men all the time, that it's much more socially acceptable and appropriate that, we can be really passionate about something, and we might express it very differently. Again, that can be very stereotypical too, but we do find cultural differences, right, in how we express emotions. We all feel them, but we express them very differently, and you can see that happens at a very young age, right? With certainly with how we raise our children and socialize kids. That little boys in the Western world, if they start to cry, they get told, hey, don't be such, be a little girl, or buck up, or whatever the case might be, right? But they're shamed in some ways to not do that, and to show that little girls not so much, right? But that is, again, socially and culturally defined in how we do that. And then of course that begins to show up in the workplace as they become adults. And so we have to overcome some of these social barriers when it comes to that, and just recognize that, again, we all have these emotions, that they're natural and normal, and begin to normalize that. Brad, other thoughts?
Yeah, well, I love, in one of our interviews, a woman mentioned this specifically. She's so tired of men overreacting to tears. And she said, when I get passionate, as Dave said, about something, I tear up. And so I want to say to these guys that, have this deer in the headlights, I don't know what to do with tears sort of reaction. Could you just have Kleenex, right? And have that in your office, and don't make it a big deal. Let's keep up the conversation. Yes, my eyes are moist, but my brain's working just fine. So could you guys stop overreacting to tears?
Great. We have another question that came in from one of our listeners that, and actually, one of your subscribers read your book, and they'd like to know what their responsibilities are as a mentee when the mentor is a man. So, I'm being mentored. My mentors are predominantly male. So what are my responsibilities when I'm the one receiving the mentoring?
Yeah, and I'll try and think of some very specific gendered, elements there. But I mean, just generally what we know about great mentees, terrific mentees show up, they're engaged, they promote a kind of a reciprocal relationship. Don't forget that mentors, when you interview mentors, one of the things they most enjoy in mentoring is learning from a mentee. And they'll often say, gosh, I think I got more out of that, than she did in the end. So don't be afraid to offer him things too, in terms of your expertise and your knowledge and your perspective, and what's going on with women in the command, what's going on with people at your level in the command. If you're passing on that intel to him, that creates, I think, a really nice reciprocal relationship. Don't forget to have fun. Many of you have a great sense of humor. Mentors often say they really appreciated that. Don't forget, if you're willing to give some feedback about what you most appreciate from him, because what we know from human psychology is when I get feedback about what's really useful or working well for her, I tend to do more of that. So those are just a few things. One of the things that we tell men in this relationship, mentoring, if he's mentoring a woman, is don't make it creepy. Don't shoot yourself in the foot by calling her your work wife or something weird like that. And I guess the same would apply for a mentee. Watch the boundaries, recognize that. Recognize that people are watching your relationship. And so don't set yourself up by doing your mentoring after hours at a bar, that kind of thing. Just the basic optics matter.
Great. One of the statements that you made earlier, and it really resonated with me. I was fortunate throughout my career to have male mentors, and they advocated for me, and they did some of the demonstrate some of the behaviors you talked about, letting me speak in a meeting, turning it to me, promoting me when I wasn't in the room, and that was important. So I got some visibility in ways that I wouldn't otherwise. So one of the questions that we received, which I think is a really great one, is how do I advocate for the male leaders in my organization that actually do promote gender diversity? So I know we talked a little bit about perhaps, measures, performance objectives, but if I'm the person who's getting the benefit of that, how do I advocate for the continuance of that in my workplace?
Yeah, and that's a great question. We had several women that we interviewed who talked about this in particular, and I think it speaks, one, to the notion, the idea that really allyship is comes from the idea of an alliance, right? It's two people, and it's not unidirectional, and that often women were there advocating on behalf of their ally, as they considered the man to be their ally in these cases, that when people were coming after him for different things, that they would stand up for him, right? Again, for things that they considered to be right, and why they were doing things. Because again, sometimes there's negative feedback that'll come at men in particular when they start to advocate on behalf of other groups. Like, so in this case for women, they might be looked at. It's like, so wait a minute, who are you to be advocating for women, right? And guys even talk about this sense, this feeling that there's kind of this wimp penalty, that because I'm advocating on behalf of women, that somehow I'm associated with that I get penalized, and they can get some of this very explicit messaging in this way. And this is where I think, again, women can, as they see their allies and they see them in these situations, they can speak up again on their behalf, especially when their allies are not in the room out there. And I think the other one is feedback. We keep coming back to this idea of feedback, and here's another great one: when positive reinforcement of good behavior, of the behaviors that sometimes as guys, I think a lot of the times we think of, these are just things, that's just who I am, that's just what I do, it was the right thing to do. But we don't always know how it affects other people, right? We're just doing it and then we're moving on. And sometimes having a little positive reinforcement, again, guys don't need to be patted on the head and on the back every time they do something right. But again, it feels good and it reinforces good behavior when we hear it.
Yeah, and just related to David's good comments there, I keep in mind that one of the things that we tell men who are trying to do this work more effectively, mentoring and allyship for women, don't call yourself an ally. Don't call yourself her mentor. Let her decide if you're her ally or mentor. So don't self-label. Don't presume that's how she sees you. We encourage men to do the work, be all in, show up every day, and be a better ally for equity in the workplace. And so, to Dave's point, when a woman does say, hey, I see you as a real ally, or I really have appreciated you being a mentor for me, that's a nice moment for a guy who's really been working to be better in this space. And it's very rewarding. It's very reinforcing. So we're asking him not to proclaim that title, but if you call him that's a nice moment for him.
This is kind of a good question too, that leads from one of the other ones you said. Like, if a man is you kind of like putting this out in the workplace and championing it, what about the men that seem arrogant or ignorant of the system of sexism? Like, some men think that they believe in equality, but then they have no other work to do, and some men think that they have a role in addressing the systematic system, that sexism that benefits them and hurts women. So what would you say to those type of people?
Dave, do you want to take this? You often speak to this issue. Yeah.
Happy to. Yeah. So part of it is, there's an element of awareness piece that's in that, right? So part of it, is he just not aware of it? And so there's an awareness piece that has to come into play. And part of that's on him. And I think as leaders, we need to be aware of where our blind spots are and understand how, for ourselves and for others in the organization, how they're experiencing this. And this, maybe you got to go on that listening tour as a senior leader out there and begin to see how, just listen and see how others are experiencing, what the challenges are with that in particular. And then I think each of us has an idea of how, especially if you're in a majority group, how we have this idea that if another group advances, so in this case, if women advance, that somehow I lose, right? This zero-sum bias or fallacy that we often deal with in the workplace. And this can hold men back, again, from engaging and doing this work, because they don't see it as something that's beneficial, right? Why would I do something that naturally, hurt my opportunities out there? But it is a bias and it is a fallacy that, again, as we see that as we advance diversity and equity and inclusion in our organizations become better, they become more effective. And certainly there isn't, to me, that's kind of almost a moral obligation for us in the military and national security, because we can't accept anything less than the best, right? We're always working toward excellence there. And so to me, we almost have this moral obligation to find these ways to become better and do that. And it's not okay to accept the status quo when we see these kinds of things out there. So we have to begin to disrupt that.
Good afternoon. You all may notice I'm not Ms. Kessmeyer. She was called away for another conflicting meeting, and she asked that I just step in and kind of pick up continuing the questions. So thank you, gentlemen, for this transition. We did get another question that came in through the chat that I also want to present to you. Again, it may sound a little bit like I'm reading it, but I want to make sure that I get the gist of this. The question is related to the data, and it says, do you have data from the corporate world proving the value of a gender diverse organization? This individual said she needs help with her narrative on why a diverse organization is so important. What's the why? So I'll ask you all to maybe elaborate on some of what you did talk about a little bit earlier with some of the data that you showed.
Yeah. Yeah, and the answer is yes, yes, and yes. There's so much data. In fact, at this point, I don't know if you agree, Dave, but at this point, it's almost not even a question anymore. There is so much evidence about how gender diverse teams make better decisions. I mean, from a real operational, tactical creativity perspective, the research is so clear. When I have more gender balance, I am going to get a better result and a better decision. National security agencies at this point won't plan missions unless women are involved on every team because they have better outcomes and they're actually tracking this data. In the corporate world, this links directly to numbers, right? Your company is going to make more money. You're going to have a better bottom line. And I'm not talking just about token gender inclusion. I'm talking about women integrated all the way up into the C-suite. If you're getting real gender balance, you're going to see a direct causative, connection to making more money, being more successful, however you measure that. I'm trying to think of a place that, besides our books, Dave, that nicely consolidates this. But, I think the McKinsey studies that come out every year or two on women in the workplace are a really nice place to go for the data. If you're trying to make the business case in your own command, go to the McKinsey Women in the Workforce or Women in the Workplace studies. And I think the latest one is 21. And you're going to find really updated data on bottom line gender inclusion numbers.
I think there's one of the interviews we had for Good Guys was with Ambassador Don Steinberg, and Ambassador Steinberg was the ambassador to Angola, but back in the late 90s, he was a special envoy for the president there during a lot of the crises and the wars that were going on in that war-torn area of Africa. And he told us that when he was first sent there to negotiate the peace process, and they had finally negotiated that everybody was excited. He was talking to the media about this, and one of the reporters asked him, "Hey, was this a gender inclusive or gender neutral peace agreement?" And he said, "Oh yeah, absolutely it was." And he said later on, as he thought about his response, he goes, "That was completely wrong because we didn't even think about gender. We didn't necessarily set out to discriminate, obviously, but we did not even think about gender when it came to that." And as it turned out, they had negotiated that peace process in the way that they always had. And they asked all the bad guys with guns to the table. They had a negotiation, and they forgave them for all the crimes they committed over the past year. And then they were going to forgive them for the crimes that they were going to commit over the next 6 months. And then guess what? The peace process fell apart again. It failed because they never had the right information, the right intelligence about how it was going, where the next infraction was going to occur. And the reason they didn't have that information was because women were not part of the process. Women in the marketplace had that information, and it was not being shared up through the chain. And because of that, the peace process fell apart. And he said for him, it was such an aha moment that, gosh, there's no way we could ever do any of this again unless we include women at every level of the decision-making process, because we're just not going to have the right information to effectively do our job.
Great, thank you both. There have been some chat questions, and I know some of the conversation earlier was related to telework and some of the impact of COVID. So I wanted to pull that string a little bit with you both. You know that much of the workforce has been working in a remote environment for quite some time now because of COVID. So a couple of the questions I might ask you to think about is, how do you serve as an ally in this environment, and what might be the impact of offering greater telework and flexible work schedule types of arrangements?
Yeah, I can start, Brad, if you want to add a
sure.
few. I know you have some ideas too, but you know, interestingly, things like telework and flexible work arrangements have long been, prior to the pandemic, been looked at as women's programs because, again, the utilization of those programs was much more by women, especially for when it came to flex work, but remote work as well. But interestingly, men had more access to these programs because of the nature of the kinds of positions and roles they were in, but women were using it more. I think over the last year that we've all recognized, especially I'm sitting here in my home office for the last year, teaching remotely, working remotely, and everything that I do, that remote work, I think we all understand the value in it, where the benefits are, where, again, maybe the downside might be as well, but there's a lot of benefits to remote work, and then also to the ability to separate that from flexible work. How is flexible work different in a variety of different ways? And in thinking about this as we integrate this going forward, and you know, I do like to look toward the future as an optimist, that we're going to take some of the benefits that we've seen in both and rethink how we're approaching the nature of work. And because, again, these experiences we've had over the last year, I think most of us can appreciate there have been some good sides, some downsides, of course, too, but we should take what we've learned and apply that into how do we re-envision the idea of what work is. And I think in particular, the notion that all of us have caregiving responsibilities, men and women, and that we need to be doing those kinds of things. And there are ways to re-envision this work so that we can be those caregivers in a way that works for everybody, is much more equitable, and not putting, you know, as Brad talked about earlier, all the burden just on women.
Yeah, no, I think that's great, Dave. And I just think that, you know, a systemic part of male allyship has got to be advocating and lobbying very publicly for policies and procedures like this that may not seem on the surface to be beneficial for men. Actually, they're good for all of us. But, you know, more immediately, women who are being far more impacted by the pandemic because of caregiving, you know, unfair balance of caregiving falling to women. This is something I can advocate for, and it's not hard for me to do this. We know the outcomes are better in terms of retaining women, retaining our best talent. Why can't we be more flexible with a lot of the work that we do? And as a leader, why can't I advocate for that? And I need to put some skin in the game there, because that may not be popular, especially with certain generations that never saw those benefits. But I can lean in and advocate.
Great. I have one last question, if I can, for both of you, and it's probably a broader perspective. How do we as leaders drive change toward inclusion?
Yeah, great question. And I think first of all, we have to think about it, look inward, and how are we setting the example and role modeling that? And I can't think of anything more important, as I talked about earlier, about this idea of having clarity around the why. Why is this important? And coming to grips with that. And one of the challenges that we find with senior leaders is that, especially if you're in a majority group out there, is that we're really uncomfortable talking about diversity and inclusion. We're really, really uncomfortable talking about the P word, privilege. So often, Brad and I, even we wrote about it in the book, that when talking to men, in particular white men, about this, that it's really hard to have these conversations of understanding that I've got this invisible knapsack on my back, right, full of privilege, these tailwinds that have been pushing me along all the way. And I think we have to come to grips with that and begin to understand that. As we understand it, then I can see how I can employ it, how I can use that for good. But you really, again, have to learn how to be comfortable having these conversations. And sometimes that's just being comfortable in the uncomfort of discomfort of it all out there, and having that. But I think it's really helpful having that personal narrative. Find that personal connection, something that's very natural and authentic to you about why this is important. It might be related to somebody in your family, a friend, a colleague, something you've seen at work, but a story that really helps you to tell and explain this. And then you can begin to shift this into the organization, into the mission, about why this is important to us as a team, as a group, and really begin to shift that. And then I think, again, we've got to learn, how do we hold ourselves accountable for doing this work, and how do we hold our organization broadly accountable for doing the work? And that's going to take a little more creativity and thought as we apply that.
And I would also just come back to the whole idea of inclusion. Remember that, in the military, in so many of our units, women are a minority, right? There are very few of them. So how can I make sure that she doesn't get left out? How can I make sure she's invited? And this includes social events. If the guys are going to beer after work, can you at least invite her? She may not want to do that, but could you at least invite her? One of the people that we got to interview was Sandy Stowe for Athena Rising. She became Admiral Stowe in the Coast Guard. And she said, I was the first commander of a Coast Guard cutter, and I was the only woman on that cutter. My whole crew was men. They didn't want a woman as a CO. I was really having a hard time being integrated. Luckily, I had one male chief who got it, and he was an advocate. And it was just small stuff. He would invite me to events. He would invite me to social occasions. He would include me in dinners with his family. It allowed me to feel like I had some belonging with the crew. And it was all because someone made sure I got included. These are, again, not heavy lifts, but just keep in mind what inclusion looks like.
Well, thank you both. As we come up right on 1 o'clock, I want to say a warm thank you to both Dr. Johnson and Dr. Smith for taking the time today to talk with us. Clearly, many great points. We can tell from the chat that there were what I would call many aha moments for many of the participants. We really appreciate you sharing your research and also your personal touches to what you have to share with us. And your last comment on, leaders getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. That's sometimes one of the most important things for leaders to recognize. I also want to say thank you to all the attendees. It's been really impressive to see the number of people who have joined this event. Thank you all again for your comments, your chats, your questions, and your participation. And I will wrap it up there, unless Ashley, you get the last word.
No, I'm speechless. This has been fantastic. Now I see why you guys get invited to do this 4 times a week. It needs to be at least 10 times a week. This 4 is not enough. So yes, thank you again. And I will post, these will get posted on the portal, and it'll be up on YouTube to view for later. And share this, guys, because this was so enlightening. Share it, share it, share it. And I saw in the chat, people said this needs to go all over the Navy. Well, share it. You guys have it in your hands. Please share it, and thank you. So appreciate everybody.
Thanks, Ashley.
Thank you.